Okay, guys. So last class we introduced psychological disorders, and we talked about kind of the history of how do we um, how do we understand psychological disorders. Up until about the 1950s, they didn't really have any understanding whatsoever of them, and so wait, am I sharing my screen? Yeah. Okay, they didn't really have any understanding of them. And then oh, crap. By the 1950s, where in the heck did, oh, there it is. Um, by the 1950s, the 1950s starts. We start looking at mental disorders in terms of what's called the medical model, which is looking at psychological disorders in terms of um, biological issues. Same thing as any other disease. And so, if they are a biological disease, then they can be treated with medicine. That definitely helped, but it doesn't give the full picture because of multiple causation. All right. Mental disorders have multiple causes. So the way that we look at them now is through the lens of it's called the biopsychosocial model or diathesis stress model, looking at how they are an interaction between our environment, our biology, and how we think about our environment, similar to reciprocal determinism. And then diathesis stress is looking at our genetics and then environmental stressors and how environmental stressors can trigger genes. Now, how do we diagnose? Well, in 1952, a book came out called The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, or the DSM. It has obviously changed since 1952. In 1952, there were 106 different disorders, and one of them was homosexuality. Right? Obviously, homosexuality is not a mental disorder. Okay, so the DSM, we've gone through 5 different revisions of it. All right, so we are now on the DSM-5. All right, Camden, I know why you're late, but Prem, I feel like you're late every single day. Um, so what the DSM does is it classifies disorders. And we're going to be going through some of the classifications. I believe there are 20 different categories of disorders now. And they include things like schizophrenia spectrum disorder, anxiety disorders, obsessive compulsive and other related disorders, depressive disorders, all right, so philias, all right, sexual disorders. So those are the different categories. It looks at addiction. The DSM-5 now includes gaming addiction as a specific type of addiction. So it classifies disorders, it describes the symptoms, such as right here is an example. This is the descriptors used to diagnose narcissistic personality disorder. And generally, what it does in the DSM is it'll give a descriptor, it'll give kind of the diagnostic criteria and a description of the disease, and then it will give you all of these different bullet points. And generally, what you have to have a diagnosis is you have to hit a certain threshold of the bullet points. So I think for an NPD, it's like you have to have like 7 of these present to be diagnosed with narcissistic personality disorder. So it classifies disorders, it describes symptoms, it estimates the prevalence of them, but it does not explain causes of disorders. Now, why not? Why does the DSM not explain the cause of disorders? Yeah, because there's no one cause for anything. That's the multiple causation. And I wish we had time to if we were in class, we would do a really good activity with this. Just shows that like not everybody, like everybody's had something happen. Not everybody suffers from a mental disorder, but we can't do it online. It's like way too personal and like way too. It's a really good activity, but so it doesn't explain the causes because mental disorders have multiple causes and different psychologists explain them differently depending on what perspective the psychologist looks at behavior through. Cognitive psychologists focus on the thought processes associated with mental disorders. Okay, biological or biomedical ones focus on the biology and medicine. Behavioral focus on how the environment affects and influences mental disorders, and so on and so forth. So when we get to when we get to therapy, you will you'll see this because the different types of therapy are focused around the perspectives, and they all look at therapy differently. Now, what are some issues with the DSM? Because the DSM is not perfect. One of the major issues that they see right now with the DSM is it has a lot of the descriptions and the indicators for diagnosis have gotten too broad, meaning like they have essentially lowered the threshold for diagnosis on a lot of these psychological disorders, making it easier to diagnose. For instance, ADHD. The DSM-5 has widely expanded diagnosis of ADHD. And the question is, all right, is this good? There are good aspects here. So a lot of times being diagnosed with something can be a massive relief. And that sounds funny, like why would you be relieved to be diagnosed with something? But it says criticisms of the DSM. Being diagnosed with something can, it sounds funny to say it's a relief, but if you have something going on and you don't understand it, and then if a doctor says, this is what you have going on, all right, that can be it can take a lot of weight off your shoulders. But the question is with things like ADHD, with children especially, are we diagnosing normal behavior as abnormal? Okay. Is a kid ADHD? A parent comes in, like, kids running around all the time, they never stop talking, they're a mess, blah, blah, blah. They're diagnosed with ADHD, and then they're put on medication, all these things. Are they actually ADHD, or are they just being a kid? Kids are wild, right? And not all childhood rambunctiousness is attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. There's another one. It's called, and where they're getting what we call false positives. which you've heard a lot about with COVID, but what's called disruptive mood dysregulation disorder, which is a mouthful, was basically just like when kids are really moody, right? And the question is, all right, are they really moody? And is this an indicator of maybe borderline personality disorder later on, or bipolar disorder later on, or are they just having temper tantrums? Okay. And so the question there can be and fall into those things like, is this good or is this bad? Maybe they're getting help, but maybe they are just being labeled as well. And that is one of the other big issues that we see with diagnosis of mental disorders, right? Diagnostic labeling can be subjective. So, for one thing, being labeled as having a psychological disorder can make others, whether it is your doctor, whether it is your teacher, whatnot, only notice though the things that fit into the pattern of behavior. If I have a student that is that has a 504 and I'm told that they have 504 with ADHD, what am I more likely to notice with that student? Yeah, exactly. Or if they're not, I'm more likely to be like, oh, there's their ADHD, all right, and I'm likely I'm just it's confirmation bias. Um, so there's a famous study on this. Guy named David Rosenhan is the one who did most of the research on this, and what he wanted to see was are doctors are doctors even susceptible to this? Okay, are medical professionals even susceptible to once there is a diagnosis, are even doctors able to see beyond the diagnosis? And so what he and his colleagues did is they all separately checked into psychiatric hospitals, and they all complained of hearing voices. They were all diagnosed as schizophrenic, even though they weren't. They were making all this up. They wanted to see what would happen. They were all diagnosed as schizophrenic. Hearing voices is one of the major symptoms of schizophrenia. After they were admitted to the hospital, they showed no symptoms whatsoever of schizophrenia. They didn't say they were hearing voices. They didn't show catatonia. They didn't show any of these things. But once they had gotten the diagnosis of schizophrenia, all of the doctors in the hospital, all they could see was their behavior in the framework of being schizophrenic. So there's one famous thing where so it took them all of them were discharged from the hospital between 7 and 52 days. But all of them were discharged with schizophrenia in remission, even though they didn't have schizophrenia and all they had complained about was hearing voices and they showed no more symptoms. The doctors couldn't even be like, wait, I don't think this is actually schizophrenia, right? They just said it was in remission, meaning it was hiding. But one of them, there's a famous one of them was writing in a notebook a lot. It's a pretty normal thing to do. But the doctors noted it as writing behavior. So even this normal behavior of writing in a notebook was seen within the framework of schizophrenic behavior, even though without the diagnosis of schizophrenia, it wouldn't have even been noticed at all. So that's the impact of labeling. One of the other impacts of labeling, and I've seen this a lot as a teacher, as soon as if you're diagnosed with ADHD, if I have a student that's diagnosed with ADHD, all of a sudden, what might that student or the parents start doing? What might start happening as soon as a kid is diagnosed with ADHD? Ah, all of a sudden, a lot of times, inexcusable behavior becomes excused because they're ADHD. I've seen this a lot this year. Like, oh, they're really just their ADHD is just really bad. Is just really bad this year, and I know they haven't turned in anything. They haven't turned in anything in 7 weeks, but it's just their ADHD is. And so all of a sudden, because the framework of ADHD, it becomes acceptable when I have ADHD, right? I'm still expected to do my work on a regular basis, even though I am ADD. So a lot of times with stuff like that, it can just serve as like a little bit of a crutch as well. All right, so lastly, here are the rates of psychological disorders in the American population from last year. Depressive disorders are obviously the most common. I think it's interesting that they combine depressive and bipolar disorder because those two are like depressive disorders are somewhere around 15%, I believe, prevalence, whereas bipolar disorder is significantly lower than that. So I don't know why they combine them because that average is skewed, probably low for depressive disorder and high for bipolar disorder. Yeah, so schizophrenia and OCD kind of they go kind of back and forth each year. Both are relatively rare, about 1 in 100. Okay. All right. Anybody got any questions about any of that? Okay. Let's go ahead and get the other PowerPoint for today. And let me get some more water and then we'll get started on that. All right, guys. So before we get started on these, all right. So I think a lot of times it's common to kind of like people always ask me like, well, if somebody has this, can they also have that have this? All right. So mental disorders, psychological disorders, oftentimes show up in clusters. Okay, and a lot of times having one makes it much more common that you will suffer from another one as well. Okay, this is what is called comorbidity, like with any disease. So if you think about like obesity and diabetes are comorbid. Means that if you're obese, people that are obese, it's also likely that they suffer from diabetes. And if they suffer from diabetes, there's a good chance that they're overweight. Psychological disorders work the same way. All right, comorbidity is when there's two or more disorders that are present at the same time. For instance, and it doesn't always go both ways, but like people that have OCD also tend to suffer from depression. Now, it doesn't always go the other way. People that suffer from depression also tend to have OCD, but it's because the OCD tends to make them depressed. Right? People with schizophrenia tend to have social anxiety disorder as well, because schizophrenia is a psychotic disorder and they are not in touch with reality, which makes them obviously anxious in social situations. Um, a lot of times with any of the anxiety ones, it's like way common. They're like, if you have generalized anxiety disorder, you probably also have panic attacks and you may also have social anxiety and whatnot. So, all right, so as I said last class, if anybody is uncomfortable with any of the subject matter, feel free, you can just mute me if we're talking about something that you are not comfortable hearing about. And or if it's triggering or whatnot. But also some of the stuff I'm going to go over relatively quickly. Like I'm going to go over anxiety disorders pretty not super fast, but pretty because I think that you all have a general idea about these already. Okay, because you learn about them in health class. You should. Okay. One of the things, guys, that I think is really powerful is if people that have dealt with any of these or know people that have dealt with any of these, giving personal experiences, I think makes these a lot more tangible and real. So if anybody has personal experience with any of these and wants to share, okay, please feel free. Okay, so anxiety disorder. Everybody gets nervous sometimes. Okay, you're nervous before a test, you're nervous before a game, whatnot. That's normal. I always hear people be like, I have serious testing anxiety. Well, that's normal to be kind of nervous before a test. Like you got to learn to deal with that. Okay, anxiety disorders are where they are in a, and just as a reminder, for something to be considered a disorder, it needs to interfere with your life. Okay. It needs to have some sort of negative impact on your life. If you're anxious, if you're just a generally anxious person, but it doesn't really get in the way of doing anything, then it's not really like generalized anxiety disorder. Okay. Anxiety disorders are characterized by generally an intense fear that something terrible is going to happen. Okay. Something's going to happen, or intense fear that you did something wrong. People who have anxiety disorders tend to overthink things a lot. They're in a constant state of apprehension, uncertainty, fear, whatnot. These are the most common. About 18% of the population in a given year will suffer from an anxiety disorder. Okay, that's about 40 million Americans. So now, anybody who has an anxiety disorder or knows somebody, what is the worst thing that you can say to somebody who has anxiety? Like true anxiety. Calm down. Okay, or what else? Yeah, relax. Or like, why you say it's not really a big deal. Okay, yeah. All right. You can't tell somebody with anxiety something's not a big deal because a lot of times they know that it's not a big deal, but you can't help it, right? You can't help worrying about this thing. It is that's what makes it a disorder. So there are a couple different disorders that fall into this category. The most broad one is what is just called generalized anxiety disorder. It's just general anxiety. All right. People with GAD are just in a constant state of sympathetic arousal. They're just always on high alert. Sometimes more than others. Sometimes anxiety might be okay. Okay. Sometimes it may be to the point that they can't even get out of bed. They are so anxious. Okay. I've had periods of this. Sometimes I have like probably low to moderate levels of anxiety most of the time, and sometimes it gets bad. It's fine. I get this bad if I don't have anything to do. Okay, like if I'm just like I get it bad like over the summer when I'm just like when I don't have anything to do. And so generalized anxiety disorder is literally just now to be diagnosed with it. It has to be present for at least 6 months. 6 months of unspecified worrying. Okay, where the worrying does not have a clear cause. Okay, if you're 6 months like worried if you're going to lose your job, that's different than just 6 months of like you're just looking over your shoulder all the time for no reason. Um, I had a student a couple years ago explain this really well. I thought that this was a really good explanation that all of us can understand. Does everybody know the feeling when you're walking up or down steps and you miss a step? Yeah. And it's like this like oh shit feeling just for a second, and then you kind of regain everything. They described it as that feeling, but all the time. Like the oh shit feeling, but it's just a constant feeling like that. So I thought that was a really good explanation of it because everybody's had that before where you miss a step and you feel like you're about to fall. Okay. Anybody got any questions about that? Here's a quick video. I do have a bunch of video. We do have some videos. Um, this is a girl kind of explaining what generalized anxiety is like. She's also going to explain you can see how other things are comorbid with it. So not only does she have generalized anxiety, she also has social anxiety, slight agoraphobia, and panic disorder. Okay, so beware, there is an F bomb in it, but I think it's a good explanation.
Want to know what happens when you get scared of being scared? Well, if I stay in my house all day because I'm thinking, what happens if I get a panic attack in public? Going to the shop or the pharmacy is not. When I'm planning ahead, I think about ways to escape. When I stand in line, I start thinking about how everything can go wrong. Unknown places paralyze me because I don't have an emergency plan for those. I hate crowds, parties, festivals, theatres. I used to love these, but now it's out of the question. I hate buses, planes, the tube because there's no easy way we can escape. I don't meet a lot of new people, partly because I'm scared, partly because it's hard to meet someone new when you're just staying in bed all day. I think too much. I think ahead, I think behind, I think sideways. If it exists, I fucking thought of it. And it's not like I can just quiz and choose not to have anxiety. It's not just simple worry. But there comes a time when you just have to leave the house, otherwise you'll starve to death and you probably have someone you really care about, so you have to make an effort. So when I walk out the door, my routine is very simple. I press the Starbucks, press the words, I can almost see the place where I'm headed, and then it kicks in. I feel the street tilting, the road is so grim it's making me burn my eyes out, and I'm probably going to fly out into space because I can't feel my feet on the ground. A million thoughts pass through my mind. No, I've been through this before, right?
Okay, all right. So I think your explanation of it is pretty good. Okay, so panic disorder. Okay, panic disorder is different than having panic attacks. Okay, has anybody in here ever had a panic attack before? Okay, probably a lot of you all have. What is it like? Anybody want to give a description of it?
I think I've had one before. I felt like when I got my concussion, I started like freaking out because the world was spinning. But I don't know if that's the same thing.
Oh yeah, no, that probably would be considered a panic attack. Yeah. All right. Anybody else?
I started like sweating and like my heart was like beating really fast when I was in I was at Disney and it was closing and I couldn't find my parents.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Yep. Yeah. I had like one in college, and like it's just you get like a really bad tightness in your chest. Your mind starts racing. Tony Soprano from the show The Sopranos had a good description where it feels like you have ginger ale in your brain. Like it's just your brain just feels like fuzzy. Um, okay, all right. Let's see. Would a mental breakdown be considered different from a panic attack? It really just depends on that. Panic attacks usually will only last for a couple minutes, and then you're okay. Whereas a mental breakdown, I guess it would really just depend on how long it lasted, but they would probably still have the same basic symptoms. So, with panic disorder, okay, panic disorder is about 3% of people with anxiety disorders. So just having panic attacks every once in a while doesn't mean you have panic disorder. It has to be relatively recurrent. And most of the time, people who have panic disorder have panic attacks, and they are oftentimes for no reason. They just come on all of a sudden in like a wave. Heart starts pounding, sympathetic nervous system goes hyper crazy, starts sweating. A lot of times they are accompanied with like a fear of a something happening. Like people who have panic attacks oftentimes also think that they're having a heart attack, which then in turn makes the panic attack even worse. Um, Sometimes people who have this feel they go into it's called depersonalization, which during a panic attack they feel like they are not connected to the world anymore, um, or being attached. You feel like almost I've seen it described where sometimes during a panic attack people feel like they are outside of themselves, watching themselves do it. It's called depersonalization. Um, These are twice as likely to happen with women. Anxiety disorders in general are twice as likely to be diagnosed with women. Now, said why is it important? I said diagnosed. Right? Why is that important? That they are more than twice women are more than twice as likely to be diagnosed with an anxiety disorder. Yeah, it's men are not as willing to seek treatment for things. So they are more prevalent in general in women, but there are probably a lot of men who have anxiety disorders that just don't get any help for them. Now, going along with panic disorder and panic attacks, and you all can watch the video on your own. It's just a video of a guy having a panic attack on live television. He's a newscaster. All right. What is called agoraphobia? Agoraphobia used to just be a regular phobia, but now it's kind of its own thing. Agora or agora is a Greek word for a large open space. Agoraphobia is an intense fear or an avoidance of crowds or open spaces. Oftentimes, this develops because people start to become afraid that they will have a panic attack in public. And they are afraid that they will have a panic attack and they won't be able to get away from get out of the situation, to get out of the public area. So for instance, and then what happens is they start to, it just kind of compounds. So for instance, let's say that you have never been afraid of going in public spaces, but then one day you're in Harris Teeter and you have a panic attack. It just comes on out of nowhere. You have a panic attack. You don't think a whole lot about it afterwards, though. And a week later, you're back at Harris Teeter. What might you start thinking about once you're back at Harris Teeter? The panic attack. You come to Harris Teeter and you're like, oh yeah, I forgot I had a panic attack here last week. And then as you start thinking about the panic attack, what might be more likely to happen as you start thinking about the panic attack? Another one, okay? You start getting worried, what if I have another panic attack? And then because you get nervous about it, you have another panic attack. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. And then the next time you go to Harris Teeter, before you could go in, you're like, oh shit, what if I have a panic attack in there? And then you leave. And then it starts to be, oh, as you're driving to Harris Teeter, you start thinking about it and you have to turn around. And then as you're getting in your car to go places, and then as you're just leaving your house, and then all of a sudden it generalizes to all of these different things. And people with agoraphobia oftentimes they literally cannot leave their house. Like they can't walk out their front door because they're afraid of what might happen. Now, does anybody know what type of learning is that? Associating a grocery store with a panic attack, and then you learn to avoid the grocery store because of that. It is generalization, but what type of learning is that? Linking two things that weren't previously linked. Classical conditioning, yeah. The grocery store becomes the conditioned stimulus. So that is agoraphobia. They have found that there have been a lot more instances of agoraphobia developing this year. Why might that be? Why might agoraphobia have, okay, been quarantined for a while with not much contact, and coronavirus, okay? Not because there have been more panic, because people are afraid to go out of their houses. They go to the grocery store, start thinking, oh my God, coronavirus is everywhere, and then they have a panic attack, and then so on and so forth. All right, so here's a quick video, news report about this on coronavirus and agoraphobia.
suffered from agoraphobia his whole life.
Point where I almost could not leave my house. Like I would walk my dogs around the block, and when I would get kind of catty cornered, basically 2 blocks away, I would start having a panic attack.
Leaders with the Anxiety and Depression Association of America say agoraphobia stops people from going into situations because of a fear of being overwhelmed by anxiety and not being able to escape. They say it's common with panic disorders.
For some people, they experience lightheadedness and they fear passing out. Other people may feel tightness in their chest, racing heart.
Ken Goodman is an anxiety specialist. He says COVID-19 is stressful for everyone and especially difficult for those who suffer from anxiety disorders.
Anxiety disorder, if you become very afraid of leaving your house because of germs, you can get the disorder, you can get the disease, that may elevate the fear to agoraphobia, where now you are afraid to leave the house.
He says people being forced to stay home is giving them a small glimpse of what it's like to deal with agoraphobia.
Because of what's going on, it's giving people legitimacy to stay home. Whereas if you have agoraphobia and there's no COVID-19, there's no legitimate reason for you to stay home. But just to make you feel like you're crazy because you are having an extreme reaction to something that you know consciously you know it's not dangerous.
Experts say with the right kind of treatment and therapy, people can overcome it.
Limit your life. You tend not to socialize with people and you stay inside, and that can be very depressing.
If you need additional resources, we have them right here on our website. Go to WTKR.com. I'm Margaret Kavanaugh for News Story.
Okay, so, all right, so agoraphobia, so Martinez just asked, are agoraphobia and social anxiety disorder the same thing? No, they aren't, and I'll talk about social anxiety disorder here in a sec. They are a lot of times comorbid with each other, but agoraphobia is specifically the fear of open spaces. It used to be just a regular phobia, and now it's like its own diagnosable thing because of the association with panic attacks. All right, so phobias. All right, I think we all know what phobias are. Okay, overwhelming, unreasonable, persistent fear of the phobic stimulus. Okay, that's the thing. It has to be persistent, has to be overwhelming, and it needs to either be irrational, like my fear of frogs and toads. I know that that's irrational. I can't help it. I freak out around them. Okay. Or it can be an excessive fear of something reasonable to be afraid of, like heights. Okay. Most of us probably don't want to be up at really high heights, but if you like freak out, then that is when it becomes. A lot of them are what are called specific phobias, which are phobias of things. Okay, Haley, you're afraid of frogs too? Yeah, they're horrible like creatures. They're just sneaky as shit and pop out of nowhere. I don't like their hands either. Okay. A lot of these are what are called specific phobias. Specific phobias are like, if you're afraid of spiders, that's a specific phobia. If you're afraid of heights, that's a specific phobia. If you're interested, this link right here, I think it links to the Wikipedia page. If you can think of it, somebody is afraid of it. Is there a mental disorder is the opposite of phobias, like where you're completely infatuated with something and obsess over it? Yes. I can't think of what it's called though. Yes, yeah, there is. That's called aphilia. PHILIA is the opposite. So Juliana asked if there's the opposite of this, right? Where people are obsessed with certain things. Yeah, that's called aphilia. That's where like a lot of times the philias come in to like sexual things, like people that are like sexually obsessed with things that are non-sexual. Like I don't know if anybody's ever seen the video of the guy who has like a sexual relationship with his car. All right, that's aphilia. I think we will cover it at the end of this unit. And yeah, it's a paraphilia. All right, so here are the most common phobias. Okay, and then here are some other ones. Popophobia, which is fear of the Pope, which, I mean, yeah. Omphalophobia, fear of belly buttons. Arachibutyrophobia, fear of getting peanut butter stuck to the roof of your mouth. Optophobia, fear of opening your eyes. Again, if you can think of it, somebody's afraid of it. Now, there are specific phobias, which are fear of things, and then there are what are called social phobias, or what is now referred to as social anxiety disorder. They used to just be all together. The new DSM has gotten a lot more specific with things, right? Social phobias or social anxiety disorder, SAD, is where you experience overwhelming fear being in some sort of social situation. Most of it is linked with an intense fear of either being criticized by somebody around other people or being embarrassed around other people. Like if you are like the center of attention. The spotlight effect plays a big role in this. Oftentimes we think that more people are watching us and watching what we're doing than they actually are. They fear making a mistake with something, offending somebody. And so because of that, they tend to avoid social situations. Now, there are more specific social phobias. Like there are some people that are afraid of this thing, or this thing, or this thing. Does anybody know what the most common social phobia is? The most common cause of social anxiety? Public speaking. Yeah, public speaking. Public speaking, I think, is by far the most common phobia in general. You know, I absolutely hate being the center of attention with things, which is strange considering I'm a teacher. But I do not like being like the focus of like a bunch of people like asking me questions or whatnot. Okay. Prevalence of this is pretty high. About 7% of people every year are diagnosed with social anxiety disorder, and about 12% of people within their lifetime will be diagnosed with social anxiety disorder. Anybody know what the other biggest kind of social phobia is? I think this is more common with girls than guys, but public speaking is the biggest, and then the second one is really interesting. That's not a social phobia. Social phobias involve like social situations where you're like being judged by other people. Appearance is, I don't know where appearance is, but I think this is more common with girls than guys. But I think the second biggest one is social anxiety caused by eating in public, right? And eating around other people. All right. So if you want this video here, we're not going to watch it because we don't have time. It's about a basketball player named Royce White who played at Iowa, either Iowa or Iowa State. And he had serious social anxiety disorder. And Grantland did a little documentary on him, and it's really well done. Okay, all right. Are there any questions about anxiety disorders? We're almost done. Okay. Okay, so obsessive compulsive disorder and other related disorders. OCD is, in my opinion, probably the most well, maybe second most behind schizophrenia. All right, but probably the first or second most misunderstood disorder because we have a tendency to use the term OCD as being synonymous with like being really uptight. Like I always hear students about like, oh my God, my mom is so OCD. She makes me clean my room like twice a week. Right? That's not OCD. Okay. Can anybody explain what OCD is? Does anybody have it or know somebody who has OCD? It is not particularly common, but all right, Emily, sorry.
It's like persistent, like unwanted thoughts.
Mm-hmm.
Consistent, like, and they have to do like I forgot what I was gonna say. Sorry. Oh, and then you like hate germs and stuff like that.
Okay, yeah.
Like,
Yeah. That's one of the common ones. So yes. All right. So something that is very disturbing to someone. Yes. All right. So OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, starts with what are called an obsession. All right. An obsession is a recurring thought in your mind that is just on like a loop. Okay, you just can't get it out of your head. It's similar to like sometimes you just can't get a song out of your head. All right, obsessions are kind of the same, but they tend to be something that is very unenjoyable. All right, so like Emily said, one of the most common ones is fear that you have germs, the fear that your hands are dirty and you have germs on your hands. So they can be that, or they can be things that are much, much darker. Like a lot of times people with OCD have persistent suicidal thoughts. Okay, even though they don't want to commit suicide, it's just in their mind all the time. They might have thoughts about hurting somebody else or whatnot, and they are very, very disturbing. And these obsessions cause anxiety. Right? So some just have the obsession and the anxiety caused by it. That's called pure O. All right, but then with OCD, what they learn is that by doing some sort of compulsion, which is a repetitive, sort of ritualistic behavior, that compulsion can then, by doing it, they find that it often, that's not how you spell, they get relief from the obsessive thought. Okay, so germs, they wash their hands. They feel clean for a little while. But then, so it's a feedback loop. But then after a while, the obsession comes back. And they got to do the ritualistic, repetitive behavior again to reduce their anxiety. Now, does anybody know what type of learning is that? That they learn that by doing this repetitive behavior, it reduces something that is not enjoyable. Yeah, it's negative. So the compulsion is negatively reinforced. Okay, because they learn that by doing the compulsion, it reduces the obsessive thought. So then that makes them more likely to do it again. All right, so eventually this just becomes a habitual thing. And the thing with OCD is people with OCD will get in a loop. Right? They will get stuck in a obsession and compulsion loop. So like one of the things might be sometimes people with OCD recognize that like the compulsion is irrational. Sometimes they don't recognize it. But let's say that like before you leave your house, you have to lock the door. You have to turn the deadbolt enough times until it just feels right. Let's say you normally have to do it 7 to 8 times. So you turn the deadbolt 7 or 8 times, all right, walk to your car, and you're like, did I lock the door? That didn't feel right. Then they got to go back and do it again. Try to walk to their car, like, that didn't feel right. Got to go back and do it again. All right, so on and so forth. And they can sometimes get stuck in this for hours, where they just have to keep doing it and keep doing it until they feel like they have done it enough to relieve whatever the anxiety is. It could be something like if they don't turn on and off the lights in a room a certain amount of times, something terrible will happen to their family. And so they might have to just keep turning on and off the lights until they feel like they have done it enough that something terrible won't happen. Okay. Checking like locks and stuff is one of the really common ones. And sometimes people will, they're like, people are worried that they didn't turn off the oven. And they like get in bed and they're like, did I turn off the oven? So they go down and check the oven, it's off. Get back in bed, they're like, wait, did I turn off the oven? They got to go down and do it again, and so on and so forth. OCD is a extremely, extremely serious disorder that is very, very distressful. And other than schizophrenia, I believe that OCD has the highest suicide rate of all the different mental disorders. It's not all that prevalent. It's only about 1%. All right, but it is it is extremely difficult to deal with. Does anybody know anybody who is OCD? Little kids oftentimes display OCD type behavior. And a lot of us have like little like tics that we do that just like you all probably know, like I like mess with my hair all the time and I mess with like my beard all the time. That's a little bit of like a compulsive behavior, but it's more just like I just do it kind of mindlessly. All right, so with OCD, you got the obsession, and then the compulsion, the ritualistic behavior gives them relief for a bit, and then they learn, and then so they keep doing it and keep doing it and keep doing it. All right, so here is a video. This is a girl that has OCD, and particularly it's the germ obsessed kind, which is probably the most common.
Lost control of her life. The 20-year-old University of Houston student scrubs her hands sometimes up to 100 times a day.
Clean underneath all my fingernails every time.
You can see how raw and discolored her hands are. Her fear of contamination results in many other exhausting daily rituals that she just can't help. Elizabeth suffers from obsessive compulsive disorder, or OCD.
Ritual after ritual, day after day. And OCD becomes a living nightmare.
Elizabeth can't even make it through part of her day without these neurotic, obsessive actions to avoid germs.
I have to open the door with my foot.
See how she won't even touch the light switch with her hands? And when she tries to get dressed, many of her clothes are off limits.
All the stuff that's contaminated in here. Like these pants are contaminated from vacation.
Her life, like millions of others with OCD, is so tough that she sometimes takes out her aggressions on her walls.
I get so frustrated that I kick and punch holes.
No one knows Elizabeth's frustration more than her sister, who also lives with her.
It's so sad to see my sister tell me multiple times a month that she wishes she was dead. And I mean, anything about it.
And Elizabeth isn't alone in this nightmare.
There are probably between 4 and 8 million people in the United States alone that have obsessive compulsive disorder.
Among them, actor Leonardo DiCaprio says he was sometimes obsessive compulsive as a child. Fittingly, DiCaprio played another high-profile OCD sufferer, Howard Hughes, in the film The Aviator. And notice on Deal or No Deal, Howie Mandel won't shake hands with contestants because of his reported OCD.
I don't shake hands. What I do is I do this because I'm a little bit of a germaphobe.
And recently, international soccer star David Beckham revealed he has some form of the disorder. While there is no cure for Elizabeth and others suffering from OCD, behavior modification treatment has proven a step in the right direction. And that's why Elizabeth is now the national spokesperson for OCD awareness.
My name is Elizabeth, and I have obsessive compulsive disorder. There are 500,000 teenagers in America just like me.
And for Elizabeth McInvale, getting help for those in her shoes is the best therapy of all.
There's people out there that struggle more than I do, and my heart goes out to them.
All right, so I have a couple other videos on there too, if you're interested. Has anybody ever seen The Aviator? Anyone? It came out when I was in high school. If you can find it on a streaming service, the movie is really good. About Howard Hughes. He had, he was a veteran billionaire. He had OCD, and it actually developed into agoraphobia as well. It's a very long movie, but it's very good. All right, so. All right, so OCD used to be just under anxiety disorders, but now it's its own thing because of the compulsions. Other compulsive disorders, hoarding. If anybody's ever watched the show Hoarders on A&E, that is hoarding disorder. Okay? People who hoard literally don't ever get rid of anything. Right? They keep old Big Mac boxes because their thought is, well, what if I need this at some point? It causes them a lot of anxiety getting rid of it. Body dysmorphic disorder, which is obsessive preoccupation with perceived flaws in your body. Trichotillomania, which is compulsive hair pulling, where people oftentimes pull out large patches of or even all of their hair. And then what's called excoriation, which is skin picking. So these are just examples of other types of compulsive disorders. All right. Lastly, okay, PTSD and other trauma-related disorders. Right? I think you all know, for the most part, what PTSD is. Okay, PTSD is obviously caused by some sort of traumatic event. And they tend to have flashbacks. We usually associate it with like veterans, and that is where it's the most prevalent. I'm not sure what the stat is now, but from about 2010 to about 2018, there were 22 veterans per day committing suicide because of PTSD. But it can be anything. Sexual assault obviously often causes PTSD, car accidents, but it doesn't have to be something extreme. What is traumatic to me might not be traumatic to you. It could be your dog dying could cause you PTSD. All right, so it's just marked by flashbacks, nightmares, fear of that experience again. People in car accidents oftentimes won't ride in a car for a while afterwards. So, are there